We're just gonna, good morning, everybody. We're just gonna wait until everybody gets in the room. Give it about another minute. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Susan Aaronson, and I am the director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub. And I would very much like to stop saying and. I'd like to thank our sponsors with whom we co-organize this event. This event is about the DataGovHub's metric on our approach to comprehensive data governance. And we devised this metric to get a sense of where governments were going regarding the governance of three types of data: public data, proprietary data, and personal data. We hope that this metric will serve as a means of understanding all the different types of steps that governments take to try to govern data, which include visions and strategies, processes, structural changes, laws and regulations, treaties and agreements at the international level, et cetera. So I'd like to introduce our three speakers. We have Thomas Stewart, who is the research director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and Adam Zable, who is the Koch associate at the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, who will present the metric. And then we have Professor James Foster, who is the Oliver T. Carr Professor of Development at GW and the Vice Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs, who will diss our metric. No, provide constructive feedback. Thomas, take it away, please.
Thank you, Susan. Appreciate the introduction. And let me just get this up here. All right. So hi, everyone. And thank you, Susan, for that. And thank you, everyone, for coming. So I'm Thomas Struett, and I'm going to kind of introduce the first half of this, this metric, this paradigm for a comprehensive approach to data governance. And then my partner, Adam Zable, he'll take on the second half. So kind of just a little bit of a recap from what Susan mentioned. We are the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and one of our main tasks is basically connecting experts to policymakers on digital trade and data governance issues to help advance the discussion in those space. But we are also academics and we enjoy our own research. So for the past year, we've been working on this project, looking at kind of the state of data governance around the world. We partnered with our partners at the Digital Planet at Tufts in the Fletcher School, kind of to assess the state of data governance. So when we started that, we kind of looked at laws, regulations, and trade agreements. We looked at 45 aspects of them, kind of looking specifically at the regulatory side of data governance. And we found a lot of interesting things that countries were doing. We learned a lot, but we also saw a lot of what countries were doing that we felt wasn't really being captured in the discussion around data governance, looking at strategies that countries were putting out, ethical frameworks that countries were producing around data governance, and also institutional structures that were changing, new bodies being created to deal with data governance, and also participatory frameworks to kind of bring in citizens, bring in other stakeholders to kind of add to the changing debate around data governance. So kind of going off of those interests that we were finding and kind of that issue we're having, we delved into the literature around like organizational change and looking at how organizations respond to rapid pace of change. So that's kind of what really got us thinking and really where we started, the frame of mind we were at when we started this metric. So kind of just to start with like a general definition of data governance, the OECD defines data governance as principles, policies, standards, laws, regulations, and agreements designed to control, manage, share, protect, and extract value from various types of data. And we think that's a good definition for data governance, but like I was saying before, we were really interested in how do nations respond to data-driven change. So kind of taking that frame, we kind of devised our own concept of comprehensive data governance. And that's where we came up with a definition for that, where we defined it as a systemic and flexible approach to governing different types of data use and reuse in a variety of contexts. So what does that really mean? Data governance is how a nation works to meet the changing societal and technological conditions brought on by digital transformation. So whether that's how a nation harnesses data for societal good, or how a nation might deal with possible harms of data to people. So we believe that policymakers are constantly working towards an approach that can take on all of these challenges, and getting at these complex and interconnected issues require taking them on from as many angles as possible. So not just from a regulatory side, but from other structural or strategic ways. So that's that. And then getting it, but data governance is also constantly evolving, reflecting changes in technology or societal values, policymakers' will, and also policymakers' expertise. So consequently, data governance is a work in progress and a different experience for all nations. So no nation in the world can be said to have found a truly comprehensive system. So for this reason, when we look to set out the different aspects of a nation's efforts to govern data, we saw it not as a series of boxes to check, but we saw it as a systemic and flexible approach to governing different types of data use and reuse in a variety of contexts. And that's kind of the frame we went into when we developed this metric. And before we really delve into that metric, I'll go over some kind of limitations and caveats just to kind of like set the stage for that. We are a very small team at the DataGovHub. We worked on this with a small team of researchers, desk studies. So we went out and looked at each nation ourselves. We have limited language skills, so we used language translation software to find documents and the indicators that we looked at. We also did have an expert to deal with Latin American countries, and an expert to look at China just to kind of cover our bases. And we had a review process to kind of make sure that each of these criteria were either met or not. And then also just in terms of kind of scope and broadness, we narrowed the kind of the scope of data governance. So we don't cover issues of cybersecurity or also governance of statistical data or research data, so that type. And we also had to remain broad. So we look at only at the national level. So we don't look at city level initiatives on data governance or sectoral governance or state level governance of data. So that's kind of the limitations. And then in terms of caveats, like all metrics, this is kind of our perspective. This is our normative approach to how we see our concept of comprehensive data governance. It is rooted in literature, but it's still kind of, this is how we see it. And also for our indicators, they purely measure kind of the existence or non-existence of certain documents or structures. They don't actually measure kind of the effectiveness or quality of those structures or documents. And just one last thing, kind of the European Union is one of our cases. And we look at it kind of as its own entity, producing its own documents, having its own structures. So it's not meant to be a summation of all European Union countries, but as its own standalone case. So now I'll pass it off to Adam to really kind of go into the ins and outs of the metric itself.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about what our metric actually is and what's involved in it. We don't have time today to go into detail about all the 26 indicators we used. nor would that be a particularly interesting presentation. But I'm just going to go over the basics of the 6 attributes that we see as the important dimensions that a country acts in as it governs data. So to start off, we have the strategic attribute. This captures the need for nations to be anticipatory with the long-term vision or plan on how data should be used in different contexts. So for this attribute, we looked for documents published by the government that issue basically guidance for different entities in society on how they should manage data they control. Sometimes a government strategy is not clear in just one document. So when it's set out in multiple documents, we try to be as inclusive as possible. The second attribute is probably the one that is most closely associated with data governance in the public's conception, the regulatory dimension. Here we focus on not just laws and regulations, but also executive orders, directives, other things like that that are mandatory, binding, and enforceable acts of state, but not only laws, but the different elements that consist of a legal regime around data. We're also interested here in comprehensive general laws and acts rather than sector-specific legislation. Again, our third attribute we call responsible. This takes into account the need for nations to consider the ethical and human rights implications of how data is used, as well as spillover effects of that use. And also it is to capture the need to recognize the responsibility of the state in relation to its people on data governance issues in a way that's not merely nice to do, but is actually a necessary and important piece of a country's data governance regime. Fourth is structural, which involves the different ways that government creates or adapts institutional structures to accommodate new responsibilities or activities in response to changing needs in a digital society. Fifth is participatory. For our purposes, participatory data governance occurs through the policy feedback loop, whereby policymakers request comment on their data governance efforts from the public, and then try and incorporate those comments that they receive back into future data governance efforts. So transparency and accountability, and in allowing different constituents to contribute to the discussion are crucial elements of data governance, because including many perspectives is essential to be able to extract the most value from data while still protecting people and keeping up with the rapid pace of change. And finally, we have the international arena. So the other 5 attributes have to do with how a country governs data domestically. But this attribute tries to gauge a country's willingness and readiness to participate in international data governance efforts and also to cooperate with other nations to do so. In this attribute, we consider both. We consider efforts involving both binding rules as well as soft norms, because the end goal, we consider the end goal for both to be an interoperable international arena as a result of participants changing their domestic regimes. So that's why we include both aspects of these. So these are our 6 attributes, which are the primary organizing principle of our metrics: strategic, regulatory, responsible, structural, participatory, and international. And these are our 26 indicators, which I'm not going to go into now, but if someone has a question on them, we can come back to later. But moving on, what we did was we used a 52 country sample. You can see the countries chosen on the left. And we searched for the existence of each of the 26 indicators we decided on in each country. We collected over 1,300 data points, which we used to score each country in each attribute, weighing each indicator equally within its attribute in order to come up with 6 attribute scores, each out of 100. After that, we developed an overall score, also out of 100, by averaging together the 6 attribute scores. So in this chart, you can see our final breakdown of how each country scores at the moment. This is all subject to change, which I'll get into later. But as of now, the UK is has the highest score, and then Germany and Australia. The US comes in here with 57 points out of 100. So there's the US. This chart also shows how each country's overall score breaks down by attribute. So that's the different colors on this chart, or how each attribute, how we weighed them and added them up to create the overall scores. You can also see a different representation of the overall scores on the next slide, where we use radar charts. So here you can see, for example, if you look at Brazil on the bottom left, you can see that much of its score comes from the regulatory, participatory, and structural attributes, with much less evidence of international and responsible action. Nevertheless, Brazil was a standout in our metric, coming in as the only country in the top 15 scorers that was not classified as a high income nation. So just to go further, a final note about scoring in this metric is that while we do want people to use our metric to compare nations, at this time, our metric assesses only the existence of the indicators, and it says nothing about the quality or the effectiveness of each nation's data governance measures. So with that blitz of information out of the way, we want to leave you with a few takeaways on our processes, our process results, and next steps. So first of all, one of our main messages that we want to leave you with is that data governance is an essential part of governance in the 21st century. By organizing thinking through our metric, we hope to promote an understanding of what is necessary for a nation to do to pursue a cohesive and structured data governance regime. We also want to stress emphatically that data governance is more than just the laws and regulations that many people think it is. No less important than regulations are international cooperation, mechanisms for participation and accountability, adapting institutional structures, and taking into account the ethical and human rights impacts of data. A truly comprehensive data governance approach has to involve all of these elements. Another point is that data governance is such a fast-moving field that we recognize that we were going to have to update the metric every few months to keep it relevant. I mean, as an example, just as we were finishing up writing our report, Saudi Arabia came out with its new privacy law, and we were unable to incorporate it at that time into the report. So while at this time we have not done any quantitative analysis on our data set, but one point we can make while looking at our data as a whole is that countries are acting more in our regulatory and structural attributes than in responsible and participatory. What this means is that we have found less evidence that a lot of governments are asking for outside feedback or acknowledging the ethical and human rights implications of data-driven transformation. At this time, seemingly mostly only OECD countries are acting in our responsible attribute. As for next steps, we intend to expand the metric in both countries and indicators covered, but we need your help and advice to continue to improve our analysis. For example, one area we are concerned about is the participatory attribute. Our goal with this attribute was to look at the extent to which countries are taking the feedback loop, whereby policymakers ask for feedback from the public and then incorporate those comments back into data governance measures. However, in the end, we were only able to assess the first half of that question, whether they asked for feedback. So any advice on how to better assess this or other areas would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank both of you. Just before I introduce James Foster again, who will provide comments on our approach, I just want to remind you, please put any questions or thoughts in the Q&A and I'll read them aloud. James?
Is that an invitation?
Yes, please consider it.
Okay. Well, hello. I'm going to go back to the top of my presentation, if you don't mind, and get to this metric that we're talking about today. I should mention that I am not an expert in this content area of data governance, but someone who just likes to measure things, loves to create metrics in my spare time. So I'm going to comment on the structure, the clarity, potential effectiveness of the metric, and point out some potential pitfalls as you move forward. So, well, overview of the metric. The purpose is given here. You've seen that. Nice description drawn from standards, I guess, developed by OECD and others. So this is wonderful. I would always put a comment there. It would be great to have a purpose for the metric that would have fewer words and a little bit more general understanding for the stakeholders, different stakeholders who may not be experts. Data source, the series of what I would call sort of test questions that you as researchers put countries to, if you will. Does the country satisfy this? Does the country have this? It's not so clear, it wasn't from the reading, who was taking or grading the test, which is extremely important to create an authenticity of a metric. That needs to be made explicit. If there are criteria or rubric that you have that can be transferred across different people who would do the same thing, that's really important to maintain what goes on through time and space. So the interesting thing about this sort of an approach is it's been used. Something very similar is used by my poverty measure, multidimensional poverty measure. But there the test is, are you, as a family, do you have access to electricity? And so it's self-reported, but it's verifiable, at least in principle, and it's something simple, easy to understand, yes, no. Obviously, you get into the fuzzy world where you have some people that are connected parts of the day and all that sort of stuff. But my point is, it's at least conceptually a quick on or off as opposed to a paragraph describing what's going on. Or the statistical performance index that I put together with folks at the World Bank on the national statistical organization's capability to actually produce the statistics that a country might need. Does the country have a census? I mean, of a particular type, different quality, they actually specify all of that, but I'm giving you the general. So it's a little easier to see what that is when you have a 1 there as opposed to a 0. That's part of my conversation at this point. And then finally, the index, obviously by definition, is in terms of a bunch of indicators that are kind of out there that suggest that this is going to have an impact. But do we really see impact? There are tons of laws and regulations in the book that go and enforce, indicators in government, repositories that tell us that this is really a great government in this particular area. And then you look on the ground and absolutely the opposite is true. So is there a way to capture the reality on the ground better? That's always a great question to put forward to you. And if not, I understand thoroughly that then the first time you start studying something, you're not going to answer all questions. Overview of the metric. This is from the structural point of view. It's a weighted mean. The score is a success rate in passing these test questions you put forward to the student, which is a country. It helps clarify the pathway to success. It helps in communicating a key element of success of a metric, which is simplicity. I tell you, it's so much easier when you have a weighted mean to explain what it is that you're doing, that it's basically average success rate of saying, yeah, we've got that. No, we don't have that. So how many? What percentage? 53. 92% we could add, we could say positively answered and so forth. So I just think that way of framing it is also a good way of presenting it to the public who'll get it because they've all taken tests. These are nested weights. You have equal weight across dimensions. Weights on indicators or test questions are adjusted accordingly to maintain the all-important equal weights. This is a standard in our approach to doing poverty. In all the other types of measures, you start with dimensions or attributes, as you call them, which are equally important, give them equal weight, and then work back from there. Because you don't want one indicator or one question to rule the entire thing. You want to make it so that the dimensions or attributes are the key elements that communicate to people, and you're doing that. So I congratulate you in following that approach. This is a solid approach. It's in general use. You can see it in the Statistical Performance Index, or Job Index, IADB, Multidimensional Poverty Index, UNDP, and so on. So let me evaluate it. And I use a notion called the intentional measurement approach I've used to develop measures. I also evaluate measures using them. Is this a good index? Is this a good metric? So the approach evaluates components, the purpose, desiderata, and axioms and other aspects that I won't get into here because I have too little time. Now, we won't get into axioms per se. I just want to give you some idea of what I'm talking about because it really does matter. This framework, by the way, that I'm talking about was first used in Mexico in the early 2000s in the regular poverty approach that they were using. Then later when we did multidimensional poverty in Mexico, and we've used it again and again to develop lots of indices. The bottom line is the second component, desiderata, might need some filling in. I just don't see some things being satisfied. It'd be great for you to kind of think about that and at least frame it for people like me, or perhaps the general public. I'll offer a few other observations at the end. So the purpose is given like this. I would say, question what you're going to do with this index. What you're going to do with this metric. I want to have an idea what you want to do. What do you hope to do with it? And to what end? What's the theory of change? Who are the change agents? And how might they use this metric? You seem to be ruling out naming and shaming, which is the common use of the Human Development Index and other sorts of things on countries to get them moving. But how else will things change? Just by throwing it out there? So is it meant to direct resources to countries, that they could be allocated to countries who need it, or to dimensions that need it, or indicators that need it, or not? This needs to be kind of given voice, I think. The axioms I'll just mention to you, you already satisfy tons of axioms because you have a great measure, this weighted mean. Simplest measure, statistically friendly, everything you'd ever want in an indicator. Goodness, great stuff. Monotonic in test questions. It means if a country answers a question correctly, it's a better score, duh. But many, many indicators out there have really stupid types of interrelationship between components and the final result. It's normalized. These numerical values really mean something. 0 means something, 1 means something, and on average, it's right. It means what it means that you answered so many percentage of the tests correctly or positively. And it can be broken down, as we saw with the different colors, and built up from dimensions or indicators, facilitating targeted action, which is really important. So a great structure with great properties. The question I might ask is, are the 6 dimensions really equally important? Are you able to justify this? Have you thought of it? Can you give us a reason for that? The reason why is that, well, Tony Atkinson has forced us to think this way, that we want to have equally weighted up front and be able to at least give a good argument as to why they might be equally weighted as we create what's called a nested weighting structure on the indicators themselves. Okay, so Desiderata, I'll just briefly get into this in the final moments that I have. This is from the Statistical Performance Index, developed the World Bank. Here's a notation, citation for you. It was built on Desiderata. You want an index or a metric, which is simple. It can be understandable and easy to describe. Why? Because stakeholders of different sorts need to communicate with us. Because you want to print the headline and be able to explain it within 2 lines in a newspaper. I mean, there's lots of reasons why simplicity is paramount. Certainly Amartya Sen has been championing that with the HDI, wants it to go back to a more simple form than what it is right now. Second, coherent. It has to conform to a common sense notion of what's being measured. So you have to have a common sense notion of what's being measured and then describe why this is really good at doing it. Motivated, it must fit the purpose for which it's being developed. Yes, whatever the purpose is it to monitor? Is it to create action? Is it to be able to target better? Rigorous, it should be technically solid, which usually means it's in a published paper somewhere or something like that, but the axioms help. Implementable, it must be operationally viable. You have to be able to get data, which then allow you to implement it, and you've proved that through what you've done today. Replicable, it should be easily replicated, which means that if I come along with all the descriptions without knowing the data, right, that I should be able to, looking at all the same stuff you've looked at, get the same result. There might be issues there because other people who are examining the same data might get different test answers than you got. So that gets into robustness and a number of other things, right? But in any case, it should be replicable, not only at a specific point in time with different eyes looking at it, but also over time, where you come back to the same country and want to see whether there have been improvements. If it's someone else who's doing it, it might have problems in replication. So you want to have a rubric down so you have it down pat. You will not change a darn thing through time in comparisons, even though you may ultimately want to change the entire structure and all the elements through time in response to what's happening in the real world. But when you make comparisons, make sure you don't. Incentive compatible, if a country looks at your measure and says, well, I'd like to make this higher, and then improves something and then finds that it's worse, that's not incentive compatible. We don't want countries to be negatively incentivized. And there are measures that do this, and even the Human Development Index has done this in the past. So I just wanted to mention that. So is this a simple measure in structure? Yes, less so in terms of the indicators, I would argue. Is it coherent? That's for the experts to conclude. It's helpful to describe in plain English, of course. Motivated, again, this is for others to look at. Rigorous, I'd say so. Great structure. Implementable, I want to know the comparability. That's the only issue I'd like to find out from you all. Is it replicable? We'll see. Is it incentive compatible? One caution, when you say you're going to update it as soon as you need to, if you update the structure, you'll get into problems here with incentive compatible. If you simply add countries and other data points, that's no problem, right? That's appropriate. But if you go ahead and change the basis upon which all countries are being compared, or all, the numbers are coming out, you're going to have problems with incentive compatibility if you do it too often. So we usually have a rule of thumb for such slow things as poverty as saying not changing it for 10 years. Maybe in this space, it's don't change it for 1 year. Maybe don't change it for 6 months. It depends on the frequency which you have going on. Next steps, random suggestions. Gosh, missing dimensions. This is what you're talking about. You've created a measure out of not anything being there. So you are actually, you've provided missing dimensions to the population. That's really brilliant. New metrics are always hitting this question. Why don't you include something else? That's a problem. Why aren't you including it? Forget about it. It's a valid question, but there are limitations from data, coherence, all sorts of things. You're doing a great job. Keep moving forward. Updating the metric. As I said, beware. Rapid changes mess things up. And I told you a little bit about the HDI being an example. Quality, of course, is an issue here, as you mentioned time and again. depth versus breadth you're capturing, depth within each dimension you're not. Don't worry about it too much, because this is a first metric, and that's the way it goes. We use the same thing for the poverty measure. We don't have depth, we have breadth. So go ahead. Analysis and correlation with GDP and other metrics, you've already started thinking about that. This is where a lot of the action comes in. You're linking this new concept to things out there and you're saying, look, it's relevant, it goes along with them. Finally, two other things. National versions. Yes, a country itself may decide to move further than you're doing with this, because heck, we're already in the top group. We want to do more. And so they get a nuanced new way of looking at this that puts more weight or more emphasis on something new. That should be encouraged. That should come through your example being out there for countries to look at. Likewise, countries that are at lower levels may wish to concentrate at another local location. Finally, cutoffs. When is a country's level too low? When you have poverty, that's a natural thing. You say, a person is poor if you're below this cutoff. Here, a country is corresponding to the person. Do you ever want to say that about a country? Good question. But yet, you certainly are indicating that with your language. The question is whether you have a cutoff that actually says that. Already you have cutoffs randomly drawn to give you, the groupings of countries. All right, that's it. Thank you very much. Really hope you got something from those disparate comments.
We got a ton from that. And can I just respond to two of them? And then we really want to hear from the audience, which is, so the speed of change in this area is just enormous. And so you said updated every year. We were thinking every 6 months. I wondered if you had any thought on that.
Updating, including additional data points, is no problem. Updating,
Right,
redefining the measure is a problem. So that's all I'm warning you against. I'm not warning against including more data. If I could do it, I would do it in the poverty measure more frequently, but the data only appear once a year or once every 2 years, usually for most poor countries, once every 5 years. So.
And then the other point is you asked the theory of change. And I think that's a really important point. And I want to just have Adam and Thomas, if they want to say anything. My response to that is that what's key for us is two things. We want to get countries to think about the relationship between their domestic policies and their international policies. And what I mean by that is there is regulatory incoherence. So that's thing one. Thing two is one thing that is truly striking, and it was in the news yesterday, which is the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy said they want to create a Bill of Rights on AI, and they want to hear from the public. But if you look at every single advisory committee on AI, and they're creating an AI advisory committee, but they are asking for experts. Whereas other countries like Sweden and Finland, as example, actually want to train their citizens in AI, and they have a free online course because they believe that public policies will not be democratically determined if citizens don't really understand how AI is used by government. Exactly. And so to incorporate this is very difficult. Did you have any? So the motivating factor, the theory of change, is actually getting the public informed and involved. That was the point Adam made, but measuring this is just so difficult. Did you have any thoughts on that? And then,
I'd just say that we've been able to engage, and I'll just jump in here. We've been able to engage the public most radically in countries. It's because they understand poverty. It's because they have a real gut feel as to what it means not to have enough education or health or living space and so on. The goal of you guys, you folks, would be to provide a vision which then can be part of the contentious discussion by folks. Maybe starting with experts, moving down to people who are not experts, moving then into people that are everyday folks when you get the words at a level which everyone would be able to get it. And so at a gut level. So that's my advice. It's hard to do. This is ethereal stuff. Let's face it.
thank you. Thomas and Adam, did you want to say anything?
No real comments beyond that in terms of just that. Yeah, completely agree that that's kind of, I think, the route we'd like to go, and very interested in that.
Yeah, no real comments from me. Just thanks so much for your comments, and we will take them to heart.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I just want to say to people, we can go a few more minutes after 12 o'clock, but let's begin with some of these comments. So the first question is, how does this work align with data stewardship frameworks? Are you interpreting data governance as focused on the regulatory structure that directs data stewardship? Thomas, do you want to?
Yeah, I can take that. So, one of the one of the values we see in the utility of this metric is kind of the 6 aspects, getting at different parts of like data governance. So when it comes to data stewardship, we kind of see it throughout different aspects in terms of looking at like the strategic aspect. We look at federal guidelines for private sector data sharing. There are, regulatory aspects of that for data stewardship, but also, so we try to fit things like that within different aspects, including beyond just the regulatory aspect. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to another question. Much of the discussion on data privacy gets hijacked by the line between privacy and security. What a good point. Have you addressed your metrics to the trade-off between security and accountability? Adam, do you want to take that?
Well, both of these are aspects that we thought a lot about. For example, we had, for a long time, we included different aspects of cybersecurity, cybersecurity laws and strategies and bodies. But in the end, we basically couldn't establish a uniform definition of cybersecurity to run with in all aspects, and that gray area prevented us from continuing with cybersecurity. Also, just all the things that were mentioned before with these kind of lots of side areas that are relevant, but for one reason or another, we just couldn't put them in at this time. We are interested in including them, and especially accountability. As far as accountability goes, that's something that we're actively interested in pursuing to a greater degree than we are now. But as of this time, I would say that it doesn't directly address the trade-off.
Okay, there's a point in the chat about a link, and that it's the wrong link for the definition, and I will make sure to correct that. So thank you, OECD. Okay, another question is, to what extent does the ability of a country's data governance regime, is it interoperable with that of other countries? Do we discuss that in the metric?
Yeah, I can take that. So kind of two aspects or two ideas around that. One of the aspects is international. So 1/6 of this is kind of looking at how do countries kind of move data governance beyond just their borders internationally. So looking at participation or being a part of things like Convention 108 Plus, or being a part of the Open Government Partnership, or joining on to the OECD AI principles, or also working on cross-border data flows and trade agreements. So we try to tackle at least that interoperable aspect of data governance. Another thought about that, not sure if this is what was exactly being asked, but when we did kind of come up with the indicators, we were, very aware of the idea of kind of having indicators that would really be too constraining and only exist in certain countries, even though another country might be dealing with the same aspects we're interested in, but they might call it something else or produce it in a different way. So that's kind of why some of our definitions for indicators are a little long-winded, because we're trying to get more at what's being done than actually saying, oh, there's this thing called an AI strategy, but it's actually, you know, we try not to constrain ourselves to the actual document, but to, you know, the country actually having a process or doing something. So that's kind of, if that's more where the question was going, we've tried to think long and hard about interoperability of the indicators themselves between different national contexts and regional differences, maybe in governance.
If I may address the questioner, this is really a toughie, because as the questioner knows, trade agreements, which are the main tool by which one might promote interoperability related to data flows, basically say enforce your own laws. And they have, you know, to varying degrees, language encouraging interoperability, none of which is binding. There is one trade agreement, the Digital Economy Agreement between Australia and Singapore, that actually tries to promote strategies for regulatory coherence. Let's see if other nations follow along those lines. That might yield greater interoperability. But right now, the governance signals in the main venue, trade agreements say they're incentivizing, this is not a word, so forgive me, but non-interoperability. But thank you for that. Do you have any suggestions as to other indicators we might utilize to see how governments are promoting interoperability? We'd love to hear them. And if you could write them into the chat, that would be extraordinarily helpful. So here's a toughie. Quite surprising to see Germany scoring better than France in the metric, as France generally performs much better in all open data indexes, is generally praised for cutting edge legislation on data, the Digital Republic law, and for many indicators, they should perform the same. So how do you explain where Germany performs better?
I can take this one. I just went and looked at the data, so I can answer this pretty exactly. France and Germany score identically on 3 of our attributes. They score identically on strategic, regulatory, and international. And you know, their scores are quite similar in the other 3 as well. But just to answer the question, France does not have a public sector data strategy, whereas Germany does. But then Germany does not have a public sector data governance body in charge of coordinating data governance in the public sector, whereas France does. But then in the participatory attribute, we could not find evidence that France had an expert advisory group on data-driven technological and societal change. So as to your point about whether they can be linked to the fact that the metric measures the existence of documents but not their effectiveness, absolutely. We make no, we say nothing about effectiveness or quality of data governance regimes, only about the existence of these things, and that is certainly an aspect, that a limitation of our metric, but also an area we intend to work to work on. But nevertheless, you know, the existence of some of these things like a public administration data strategy and an expert advisory group on data-driven change are things that, you know, whether or not they exist is in itself meaningful.
Yeah, the question, I think it is a toughie. We really don't want this to be a beauty contest in any way. And this is where we are struggling, because in order to present the data, it does look like a beauty contest, right? And I wonder if James Foster has any thoughts on that.
I do. There's a whole literature on robustness And robustness says, suppose you tweak the weights a little bit one way or the other. Does it really lead to the same ranking between the two countries? Clearly in Germany and France, tweaking the weight just a little bit, a very small percentage, would lead to a reversal of the ordering, and therefore the result that one country is above the other is not robust. And so if you follow that literature, look under my paper with Suman Seth, Mark McGillivray in econometric reviews a few years back, and we talk about that approach to understanding when not to stress that rankings are meaningful. They're certainly not in that case.
Yeah. And the other point is that there are snapshots. And again, this is just shocking how much every day there's something new, and hence our metric is out of date. Whereas for poverty, you know, it may take years for people to get out of poverty. That's certainly not a good thing. But this is so new to governments, that it's, yeah. So thank you for that response. Another person asked whether it's possible and desirable to say something about data governance at the local level. And that's a great point. Thomas?
Yeah, I think that really gets to kind of what Susan was just mentioning about how fast things are changing, and kind of that's something we're very interested in is, you know, new participatory frameworks. And like, this is still a lot of people are experimenting. So a lot of like local initiatives, community organizing around data governance, like there's a lot of really interesting things going on there, but our metrics simply just can't, like at this moment, getting into cities, getting into like sectors or state level governance is just kind of too much, you know, to tackle. But completely agree that some of the data governance happening in cities is some of the most experimental, new and novel forms, and really interesting stuff happening at the local level.
Thank you. A comment in the comments is that it would be good to see how national regulations have an extraterritorial impact on other countries' approach to data governance. And honestly, in our proposal for next year, I've been trying so hard to think about that, because you have this mix, right, between governments that have put in extraterritorial measures. Can you say the Cloud Act as example, and others who have barely figured out how to do this. But that is, I just wonder if anybody has any advice along those lines, because in a sense, we are then measuring effectiveness or impact, and we don't do that. So I don't know how to accommodate that, but we really welcome your suggestions along those lines. James, did you want to say anything there?
Yeah, I'll mention that eventually you're going to have groups of countries that are talking to each other in terms of your own measure. It's going to happen because it's cutting edge. And when you have countries that get together to talk about this, that's when the excitement occurs. You can have all kinds of things take place there as they transfer directly from one to the other, the technology each is using and is found successful in achieving their own ends. So something akin to the multi-dimensional poverty peer network, which has 60 countries in it to spread the gospel of multidimensional poverty, can also spread, you can have your own group that spreads the gospel of your multidimensional approach to data governance.
I hope that happens. We're trying to create a study group with my partners at Oxford and CG and Chatham House and University of Sussex. That is multi-country. We're trying to pilot that. And the issue we'd like to do there, if it happens, it's a big if, is the regulatory coherence issue. But it's going to be tough. I do feel like governments are ready to hear on this, but, ready to think about new approaches, but I don't think they're yet ready to think about coherence. That's just my opinion. So we have another question. Do you see the numerical metric as the most important part of this project, or the more qualitative info in a dashboard format that you would like others to dig into? Thomas? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, so definitely the qualitative part to us is something really interesting. We think like beyond just the ones and zeros, the actual data of the documents is really something we want people to delve into. And we really would like, one of the things that we have our own kind of utility in creating this. We're really interested in like, our definition for comprehensive data governance and kind of showing off how like these 6 aspects make up data governance. But we do understand that other organizations, other people will find their own value in this. So we are really interested in hearing how other people would like to use it, are using it. So that's something we're really interested in. Yeah.
So to build on that, if you have comments, I mean, we can stay for a while. We don't want to keep James and we don't want to keep anybody, but if anybody would like to give us feedback, after 12, like, why don't you consider this or whatever, we are ready to hear it and we're eager to hear it. Okay, we have a suggestion along the lines, which is for the participatory dimension. Would it be appropriate to consider, in addition to comments on policy mechanisms, for the public to exercise control, like the GDPR right to be forgotten or FRCA credit reporting correction requirements? Would anyone like to take that one on?
Yeah, so kind of along those lines within our regulatory aspect, we do look at kind of rights that people have in the sense of a data portability right, asking for your data to be ported from one organization to another. So that's kind of where something like that would fit in. So those could be possibly good regulatory indicators in the future. But particularly for our participation attribute, we were really trying to look more at kind of stakeholder citizen participation within the policymaking process. So kind of deciding the actual governance of data rather than just like individual rights around data governance, to like distinguish between those two.
Thanks. In looking at differences among countries, has there been work on cultural differences? Adam, do you want to take that?
Sorry, where's the question?
Has there been work on cultural differences?
Cultural differences, especially resilience and flexibility under stress. My answer as of now is that we don't look at those things. That would be, there's a rich area for further research to be done, quantitative research to be done on the data set we've collected. And that would be one of them, to see how different regions, how the scores of different countries and different regions differ, converge. And I think cultural differences would fall under that as well.
Thank you. So someone asked if we'll be issuing a press release. We did issue a general, an executive summary in the Washington way, and we probably should do a press release. Our concern is that it will become a beauty contest ranking, but certainly we want to work with the press to explain that this is a picture of data governance. But if you, whoever asked that question, anybody else, if you send us your email, we'll send you out something that's kind of summarize it. And thank you. Do you have any plans on articulating the metrics with policy diffusion and transfer perspectives? Do you want to take that, Thomas? Policy diffusion and transfer perspectives.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry, I missed that.
I would love to hear It's from SG. I would love to hear if you have any plans on articulating the metric with policy diffusion and transfer perspectives. I think that's a question of how you're going to get other nations to take up this and do capacity building and help other countries. So I've been thinking about that, and I haven't figured out any solutions in terms of capacity building. Thomas and I wrote a paper about it, what could be done at the WTO, but that's very different from using this metric. So I welcome any suggestions. James, did you have your hand up to say
I
something?
did. I can actually
Okay.
report on that because one of the things that you can do is have a small, particularly webinar that actually gets really deep into it. It's a kind of a summer course. And certainly with poverty stuff and many other different types of indices, we've done this. We have a summer course, which lasts for a period of time, and you train the next cadre of people working in ministries that they can actually bring this to their minister and say, look, this works. Let's go with this. And before long, you start seeing countries adopting it right and left, or at least paying attention to it at the very least.
But James, let me push you on that. You had either the World Bank or the UN Development, you had those contacts in the international organizations to get them to bring the right people. How'd you get?
Did not matter. That was not relevant. The people who mattered were people on the ground at Oxford, my partners who were simply used to creating great courses, and they went out directly to governments. And I remember walking to our own government and walking into USAID, Feed the Future, and saying, we have this technology. And before another year passed, it became the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. So you never know what's going to happen just by reaching out to people in government or people in different positions who are facing the same difficulties, maybe in a different realm as you're solving. So it can happen. You don't need the World Bank. You don't need the UNDP, even though they've been great partners.
Okay, that is a great point, and we really appreciate it. And I want to highlight, we have great partners at Tufts and other organizations that have funded our work. And we hope that some corporations will start to think about the impact of this, particularly the interoperability question. Here's another question. I'm curious how you control for the impact of the EC regulations on the ability of, this is a great question, of European countries to move ahead faster, i.e., how does France or Germany benefit from the GDPR and other such laws? Adam, do you want to take that?
Well, I don't think that right now we do control for that, but in one of our plans for next steps is to go back and look at the timelines for each indicator and figure out when each document was published and when each institution was formed, et cetera. And in that way, once we have dates on some of these documents, we can then attempt to work out things like timelines, and then we could try and control for specific pieces of regulation.
Okay, someone asked for a summary tweet. So our tweet would be, many nations are beginning data governance, and some are very advanced, but most nations are doing very little to address human rights, international, and ethical concerns. So that's your tweet to the person who asked for a tweet. And we've been tweeting about it, but we welcome anybody's thoughts on how to do this better to get the word out, because that is the hardest thing. And as James suggested, we need to make everything simpler and clearer. How does the framework accommodate the role of data science and the challenge of moving goalposts such as AI and machine learning? Well, that's what we said about the updating it every 6 months. Does anyone want to add to that?
Yeah. So one thing we're like, since we're not just focusing on regulations, but trying to look at kind of the processes and approaches that countries are taking. So kind of, setting up institutional bodies or having participatory frameworks, a lot of those governance frameworks kind of, can last through these things too. So that in a way it does accommodate for it, not just regulations for specifically new technologies, but kind of creating institutional changes and participatory frameworks to last throughout the, through technological change.
Okay. Any other comments? I think that's it for our comments. So I guess we should, and we will definitely respond to Stats Canada. So we want to thank everybody for participating and joining us. And we really want to thank our funders at Tufts, at IDDP, at GW Cyber, and our partners in webinars. And we hope everybody has a great week. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.